The term generational prospect gets thrown around quite a bit nowadays. By definition, that's a very high mark. These kinds of players that you only see once in a generation. But in reality, the term can be used a little bit more loosely. And oftentimes, a player might be called the best prospect since LeBron James. And sometimes they go on to become good NBA players, sometimes they don't. But in the 2022 NBA draft, there was a player who was not given the label of generational prospect and rather was not even expected to be the number one overall pick. Even hours before the draft, there were a couple players mocked before him. But with the number one pick in the 2022 NBA draft, the Orlando Magic would select Paolo Banchero. And in regard to players and prospects that we may deem generational, there is a very short list of players who can ever reach that mark, and Paul Banchero deserves to be there. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts, and today we're taking a look at Paul Banchero. To begin, let's take a look at where it all started in the NBA for Paulo, and that is, of course, the 2022 draft. And in that, there were two players that were widely regarded as better prospects, those being Chet Holmgren and Jabari Smith Jr. Even hours leading up to the draft, the Orlando Magic were predicted to take one of those two guys. But instead, they made a little swerve. They knew who they wanted, and that wasn't who the media expected. Instead, it was Paul Banchero out of Duke. And in being drafted with the number one overall pick, there are expectations placed on you from day one that you step into the league. And Paulo, to his credit, came into the NBA and was instantly a 20-point per game scorer. That is a mark that even some of the best scoring rookies do not achieve. But for the Orlando Magic as a whole, this team had a lot of gaps to fill, and in year one, they weren't really going anywhere. They did not have an upward trajectory. Rather, it was just allowing Paulo to develop. And then in year two, not only does he up his averages, they go on to make the playoffs. And it starts off a little bit shaky for Paulo. There are some inconsistencies. But as his time in the postseason progresses, he consistently puts on better and better performances. And so now you take a look at the trajectory of Paulo. He built upon what he did in an already impressive rookie season. And in year two, he's translating that to the playoffs. He didn't just get to the postseason, but he's building upon what he did in the regular season while he's there. And then going into year three, the expectations, they are higher than ever for both Paulo individually and the Orlando Magic as a whole. Paulo, at this point, while he started off in the postseason with some inconsistencies, the way that he was able to iron that out, it looks like he's going to be a steady, consistent player performer from here on out. And for the Orlando Magic as a whole, now you're a couple years into the Paolo Banchero as well as Franz Wagner core of your team. And you also get the addition of Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who is not necessarily a major needle mover in terms of the headlines, but a very valuable role player and someone that should be able to contribute to your spacing. So for both Paulo and the Orlando Magic, expectations are as high as they've ever been. But in year three, some question marks begin to arise. Paulo is struggling a little bit with efficiency, and he's also dealing with injuries for really the first time in his career. Season one, he played 72 games. Year two, he played 80. But now we're getting wider stretches of non-Paolo Banchero. And typically when a franchise is without their top star, their cornerstone, they might struggle, they might falter. But the Magic more than stay afloat under the lead of Franz Wagner while Paulo is out. And this only begins to raise even more questions about his ability and what he really means for this team. Because even going into the season, while there was plenty of optimism about Orlando, there were question marks about the fit of the duo of Franz Wagner and Paulo. These are both wings who can do a little bit of everything on the offensive end, whether it's playmaking for others, creating for themselves, as well as being solid rebounders and pretty good scorers. But their negatives are also quite similar. They both don't excel on defense, and especially in the case of Paulo. And it hadn't been seen as an issue for Franz until this year, where he really struggled early on. They don't look like great shooters, and the Orlando Magic are a team that really struggles beyond the arc. So, can this duo, with their positives being quite similar, and then them having quite similar negatives as well, can they be complementary to each other and lead this team to glory? And while Paulo is out, Franz Wagner continually puts on better and better performances relative to a rough start he had to the year, even getting some all-star consideration. And the record for the Magic without Paulo, they're more than staying afloat. So then we get to where we are today, and question marks are beginning to form around Paulo and if he can truly be this keystone, this franchise cornerstone for the Magic. But what he has done since the All-Star break has been incredible and kind of plunged those doubts into a little bit more silence. Throughout March, he's averaging 30 points a night, 7 rebounds, 4 assists, and notably for him, doing it on 50, 40, 83% splits. It was not a doubt of what he was able to do offensively, but his impact alongside that, alongside the production. And one major knock was his shooting, but he's shooting better than he ever has throughout this stretch. And that brings us to the question of what were these lies about Paolo Banchero as stated in the title, as well as what does the future look like for him? What is the peak of Paolo Banchero? And these supposed lies, they do seem to have some merit to them at first glance. There are these question marks of if Paul can be the number one on a great team, if he has what it takes to be the guy for the Magic for the next 15 or so years, if the duo of him and Franz can really work together. But what is so often lost in these questions is the age of Paulo. He is only in year 3. He's not going to have everything ironed out by this point in time. And we've seen so many flashes from him, especially in the face of doubt, whether it's early playoff inconsistency or especially question marks about his inefficiency this year. Eventually, he finds a way to put it all together. And he's averaging 25 points a game this season. Whenever there is doubt coming number 5's way, there might be moments early on where he struggles, but ultimately he overcomes it. The challenges and the obstacles are not insurmountable. Rather, he continually climbs and becomes an even better player. And that is the mark of a great player. Because at the end of the day, everyone in the association is talented. But it's what you do with that talent and the drive and desire you have for the game and ability that we see from the greats like Michael Jordan or LeBron James to take disrespect or doubts and turn that into fuel for the fire, turn that into motivation. That's what Paolo Banchero has done. And he's very far from a perfect player, but he's still so young and he's continually showed improvement as well as flashes of the great player that he can be. And so while there are absolutely doubts to be had about him, Paul has continually proven that he can rise above the obstacles of his game and become even better, to reflect on his flaws and seek to become a better basketball player. He is not a finished product, but rather one who is still developing and looks great right now, and he's only going to get better, barring major injuries or major setbacks, because that is the continued pattern that we have seen from him. And in regards to what we may see from him in the future, once again, I'm not fully sold on the idea of Paulo and Franz, but given what we've seen recently, the primary focal point of your offense is very frequently going to be asked to do less on the defensive end. And if you're able to have Franz be a solid defender as well as surround them with guys like Jalen Suggs, who are able to be lockdown defenders, or Jonathan Isaac when healthy, or if healthy in his case, we've seen from teams like the Dallas Mavericks making the NBA Finals last year with Luka Doncic, who is very much not known for his defense. If you surround your offensive focal point with very capable defenders, then you can hide his flaws and exemplify his strengths. So I don't really have that many question marks about this duo. They're still going to hash out chemistry if they're going to make it work, but they've got all the time in the world. And if surrounded by the right players, I have no doubt about this duo. You take a look at the Boston Celtics. There were questions for years about Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, if they could make it work, if they could be a championship duo, because they, much like Paolo and Franz, they are very similar. So is that complementary or is that contradictory? And ultimately what we saw, players are going to have off nights. And if that happens, when you have a duo of the level of Brown and Tatum, the other is able to take that mantle, take the offensive load, and lead the team. Jaylen Brown was the Finals MVP, and in the eyes of most people, he was not the best player on the team. And that's a great example of that. So I think ultimately that those two can get it done in the future. And then for Paolo individually, there are often comparisons for this big, often on-ball forward to the likes of a LeBron James. In my mind, I see him more as kind of a mix, a middle ground between Carmelo Anthony and LeBron James. He's a very gifted scorer like Carmelo, but he can also create more akin to LeBron James. Although often he looks more for his own shot, as evidenced by the 30 points and 4 assists he's averaging in March. So somewhere in the middle ground, right? A great scorer, that's on both ends of the spectrum. Carmelo, of course, not known for his passing. LeBron, one of the best passers we have ever seen. Paolo Banchero is somewhere in the middle. And for his peak, I could see him being a 30-point per game scorer if he can iron out his shooting. Because the splits right now of 50, 40, 83, we've truly never seen that before from Paolo. But if he is able to be, say, a 36% shooter from beyond the arc, that's more than good enough for what he's asked to do for this team. Especially if Franz, who, despite early struggles from beyond the arc early on, once Franz gets his shot back, because ultimately you don't just lose a jumper for the most part, then Paolo doesn't need to be a lights-out shooter, but rather a go-to scorer, a focal point for this offense, and one that has a good team around him. And with a good team around him, I think the sky is the limit for him. And with his combination of size and ability, as well as everything we've seen from him, especially as an offensive engine, so often we talk about generational prospects, and so often these players, they don't live up to it. But if we're talking about a player here who has already shown flashes and is only getting better, still has areas to iron out their game and become even greater, become even more impactful, I think Paolo Banchero absolutely deserves to be up there. And that is all for today's episode of State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. Thank you very much for listening. This was on coming into it that I had quite a bit of desire to make. Paolo is one of my favorite players in the league, and perhaps I'm biased because of that. But there's been so much discourse around him in regards to question marks surrounding him when he's only in year 3. And also discourse around so many players to be, the next best prospect since LeBron James, when in reality, I think so often we can kind of forget what's right in front of us. And Paolo is very, very far from perfect, but he's only getting better, and we've already seen so much from him. And I think he has a great, great future ahead of him. So that is all for today's episode of State of the Association. Thank you very much for listening.